Good morning. Glad you're here. Glad you're listening in. This week I was reading about zeal. Zeal for being a Christian. And how the opposite of that is being lukewarm. So that's what I call this lesson. Are you lukewarm? You know, every Christian needs to, on a regular basis, periodically, examine themselves spiritually. Toward the end of Paul's second recorded letter to the church at Corinth, he tells them in 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5, examine yourselves as to whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you are disqualified? We do not, and this is the reason for examining ourselves, we do not want to discover that we have become lukewarm in our Christian lives. You know, we read about a congregation in the first century that had become lukewarm. In Revelation 3, verse 15, it says, in talking to the church at Laodicea, I know your works, that you're neither cold nor hot. I could wish you were cold or hot. And this example, this illustration, Brother Shoemake brought to my attention when I was reading it, and I think it really hits the spot, really hits the nail on top of the head. Because Jesus here is comparing, right? He's comparing Christians to a drink. He talks about it being hot or cold. And he hopes, and this is, you know, John's hope here, he hopes that the drink is cold enough or hot enough to make a difference. And I like this illustration. I think it's really good because on a hot day, an icy drink is very refreshing. It really hits the spot. It really makes a difference. On a cold day, a hot drink is very satisfying and warms you from the inside. So either very hot or very cold makes a difference to someone. That's what Jesus wants Christians to do. He wants Christians to make a difference, to impact the people around them. That's what he wants us to do. See, a lukewarm drink is pretty well useless. You know, just a kind of a warm drink in the summer, that's not very satisfying. A slightly warm drink in the winter, not very satisfying. So he wants us to be hot or cold. That way we can be satisfying. We can help and impact people around us. So, what does a lukewarm Christian look like? I got these questions from Francis Chan in his book, Crazy Love, and they really hit the spot. Going to make everybody think about this, about answering the question, what does a lukewarm Christian look like? Well, first of all, lukewarm Christians, they love God, but not first. God's not first in their lives at all. Remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount? We go all the way back to Matthew chapter 6, and we know what he said. Matthew 6, verse 24, Jesus says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. That's kind of like saying, who are you going to put first? He would later say, verse 33 of that same chapter, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. See, that's putting God first. Lukewarm Christians, yeah, they love God. They just don't put him first. Later on in Matthew's account of the gospel, we come to these words in Matthew 22, verses 37 and 38. These again are the words of Jesus himself. Matthew 22, verses 37 and 38, Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. That's the first and great commandment. What is the most important thing? Put God first. That's what Jesus is saying. Everything. Okay? And when he says heart, soul, and mind, that's our entire person. That's us. So he wants every part of us to put God first. Lukewarm Christians don't do that. You know, they love God to some extent. They just don't put him first. They don't seek the kingdom of God first. And so that's how he's pointing out here what a lukewarm Christian is. What else? Lukewarm Christians believe religion is a good and important thing to have. But they don't think that being a Christian should consume their whole selves. Right? We shouldn't be radical Christians. You know, we need to just fit in with the world. Okay? If people know that we're Christians, great. If they don't, great. We don't want to make waves. See, lukewarm Christians don't make waves. They just want to fit in. They want to be part of the crowd. They want to be accepted. But they don't want to stand out. They don't want to stand out at all. They just want to have just enough religion, just enough faith to kind of ease their conscience. Okay, well, I'll attend services every once in a while, or I will maybe pray occasionally, or I may study every once in a while. You know, just enough to kind of make themselves feel good. When Paul wrote his second letter to young Timothy, this is what he said in 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy 3 verse 5. He says, in talking about certain types of people, you know, he begins in verse 2, for men will be lovers of themselves. See, lukewarm Christians love themselves. So verse 5 he says, they have a form of godliness, but deny its power. See, they have some godliness. They live in somewhat of a godly way. They have some faith, but they just don't have enough to make a difference. So they just have just enough to kind of make them feel good, to kind of ease their conscience. But they really deny what the Christian life is all about putting God first, not putting themselves first. And so they just have enough to ease their conscience. Number 3, lukewarm Christians love others in theory. In other words, they will say, yes, I love other people, but they really don't put it into practice. It's kind of like saying that you believe in God, but it doesn't affect how you live. Some people, and I like this phrase, they're practical atheists. Now, they say they believe in God and love God, but their lives indicate that in reality they're atheists, because believing in God doesn't affect how they live. So here, a lukewarm Christian, what do? Well, again, in theory, maybe in their mind, I kind of love other people and I want what's best for them, okay? But that never translates into their lives, their practical lives. It doesn't, by looking at them, you would never believe, all right, that they loved other people. Now, they may do some good for their close friends or maybe their family, but that's it. And that's only if it's convenient. Don't ask them to sacrifice. Okay? Don't ask lukewarm Christians to sacrifice because they're not going to. They're not going to sacrifice with their time. They're not going to sacrifice with their money. They're not going to sacrifice with their energy, their possessions. They're only going to do it if it's convenient. All right? They don't really love their neighbors like they love themselves. Now, we stopped back in Matthew 22. We stopped at verses 37, 38. If we go on a little further, notice what Jesus would say after that. So Matthew 22, I'm going to go back and read 37 and 38. Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment." Now, 39 and 40. "And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So they don't love their neighbors like they love themselves. Now they may love them in theory. They may say, yeah, I love my neighbors. I love my co-workers, or I may love this person or that person. But it never affects their daily lives. They never really put it into practice. So they love themselves, but they don't follow what Jesus says. Love your neighbor like you love yourself. Most of us love ourselves pretty well. So love your neighbor that way too. If we turn over to Luke 14, we'll notice, again, words of Jesus. Talking about taking the lowly place. In Luke 14, beginning in verse 12, Jesus says, "Then he also said to him who invited him, when you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just." He says you will receive your reward on the day of judgment. That's when you're going to receive your reward. Because what? Well, the poor, they're not going to be able to repay you in this life. Or people who are, as he says, lame and blind and so forth. Those type of people aren't going to be able to repay you. So be concerned not just about your friends, your brothers, your relatives, your rich neighbors. Don't be just concerned about them. Be concerned about these others. So here's the fourth thing about lukewarm Christians. They have good intentions. All right, I think lukewarm Christians probably have good intentions to, participate, to be involved someday. Yeah, I'm going to read my Bible much more someday. Or I'm going to go help the elderly someday. They do have good intentions, but they don't use their time very well. They don't use their resources wisely. In other words, again, they're spending it more on themselves and their close friends. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul would tell the church at Ephesus, he's talking to Christians, tells them this in verses 15 and 16. "See then that you walk circumspectly," which basically means carefully, watching all around, "not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil." Walk carefully, use your time well, use it efficiently, use it wisely. Because once you use it, it's gone and gone forever. So, Put those good intentions, execute them. That's what he's saying. Execute those good intentions. Put those good intentions into practice. Instead of saying, I'm going to do this someday, make a plan. I'm going to do this now, or I'm going to do this at a certain time. I'm going to make sure I get this done. Number 5, lukewarm Christians are not inspired to grow. They're not inspired to become more zealous. They're pretty well satisfied where they are. Okay? They're lukewarm. They don't want to become hot. They don't want to become cold. They're satisfied being lukewarm. In the very first chapter of James, James tells us this, beginning in verse 21. James chapter 1, beginning in verse 21. James says, therefore, lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Now he gets to the heart of it. But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. See, he says if you are just hearing the word, but not putting it into practice, you're really deceiving yourself. You're living a life of deception. So he says, for if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does. See, this person, when they really look into it, you know, there's a difference here in these words. The first person, he observes his natural face in a mirror. What does he do? He just kind of glances into the mirror, sees himself, goes away. He doesn't take a good, close look. The second person does what? He really stares into the mirror. He wants to see what kind of person he is. So, he's not a forgetful hearer. What he sees in the mirror, he remembers. Oh, I need to grow in this area. I need to add these fruit of the Spirit, or I need to add these Christian graces. That's what I need to do. So when he looks in the mirror, he doesn't forget what he looks like. But he does what? He's a doer of the work. That's what he does. So lukewarm Christians, see, they're not concerned about adding more fruit of the Spirit. They're not concerned about adding more Christian graces. They're just fine where they are, and they've got just enough religion to make themselves feel good, and that's it. They don't want to grow. They don't want to become more zealous. They're looking into the mirror, briefly glancing, forget who they are. Number 6, lukewarm Christians are often silent about their faith. Now, they may set a good moral example. You know, they may not be dishonest, or they may not be greedy or anything like that. But they rarely mention their faith to anybody. In other words, that's not anything that is important enough to them to tell anybody. Tell anybody about, where they go to church, or about what they were studying in the Bible, or whatever. We have one of our assistant superintendents at Webb City is always talking about his faith. I mean, when he has all 1,000 of us in a theater at one of our meetings, always mentions his faith. Always. Doesn't care if there's 1,000 people there or not. That's what we're talking about. Letting people know that your faith is what your life's about. Remember, Romans chapter 1. The 16th verse in something very important. Romans chapter 1. And we know what verse 16 says, but I'm going to read it. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. For it's the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek." So, what does Paul say? I'm not ashamed. Paul was not silent about his faith in any way. He was not silent. He wanted people to know he was a Christian. He wanted people to know that Jesus Christ was his motivation. That's what he wanted people to know. Yeah, other things were important, but not as important as Jesus. And then lastly, number 7, lukewarm Christians put more faith in their own strength instead of relying on God. Listen to Luke 12. Again, these are the thoughts, the words of Jesus. Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 16. This is the parable of the rich fool. Verse 16, Luke 12. "Then he," referring to Christ, "spoke a parable to them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully, and he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this." See how self-centered he was? "I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you've provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." See that rich fool? He was relying on himself and not God. It was all about him. And lukewarm Christians can do the same thing. Put more faith in themselves than in God. I'm sure there are many others, but I want to close with 3 questions for self-examination. You know, we started with 2 Corinthians 13:5. Examine yourselves to see whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves. Here's a few questions for self-examination, and we'll be done. Number 1, do you use character? Do you choose character over comfort? Do you choose holiness over happiness? Well, those are some soul-searching questions. Number 2, do you draw near to God often through study and prayer? It's another soul-searching question. And do you put God's glory above your own personal preferences? Soul-searching questions. Self-examination. Those are things that as Christians we need to continually and regularly examine ourselves with these real honest questions and give ourselves honest answers. That's why it's so very important. So this morning, Doug has chosen a invitation song to help us think about our relationship and are we lukewarm Christians? Let us stand and sing this invitation song.